Hi, I'm Rodi Srivastava,
I'm Anuradha Nagraj.
and this is The Migration Story.
मैं दिल्ली जाता हूँ मजदूरी के लिए। काम मिल जाएगा, सही रहने का ठिकाना हो जाएगा, तब जाऊँगा परिवार को लेके। घर पे थोड़ी सी खेती है, इसलिए बाहर जाने की सोच रहा हूँ। चलो नेटवर्क से मुझे एक सहायता मिली है कि टिकट बुक भी करा दिया है। मेरे परिवार के 2-3 आधार कार्ड थे, वो भी सुधरवा दिए। एक और है, वो भी बनवाने की बोल दिया। बचत बीमा का बोला था, वो भी बन जाएगा। वैक्सीन प्रमाण पत्र, पैन कार्ड भी बनने का बोल दिया, वो बोल रहे थे बनवा देंगे।
Migrant construction workers, or any construction worker, but especially migrant construction workers, they're on a clock. They can't skip work. Imagine we have to bring them during the work hours, right? This is when the banks open. And so they're losing money. Let's start creating a agent training and agent program, what we call them Chalo Sathis, who would be our champions, our last mile service providers for these migrant communities. You know, when you're a financial service provider, you're handling people's money, you're touching their money. It's a fiduciary responsibility you have to. It's like being a doctor. It's a serious responsibility to give financial advice, to handle their money. And I think what we saw was when we went as a non-profit, impact-oriented framing to our end beneficiaries, they didn't trust us. They were like, what do you want?
The present presses automatically on you. The future does not. To attend to the future requires bandwidth, which scarcity taxes. When scarcity taxes our bandwidth, we become even more focused on the here and now. We need cognitive resources to gauge future needs, and we need executive control to resist present temptations. As it taxes our bandwidth, scarcity focuses us on the present and leads us to borrow. An excerpt from the book Scarcity, Why Having Too Little Means So Much by Sendil Molainathan and Eldar Shafir. Hi Varun, thanks so much for speaking with me today.
My pleasure, Namrata. I am happy to do this.
Very excited about the chat we're going to have. For all of our listeners, I am speaking with Varun Aggarwal this morning. He is the founder of the Migration Now group, which includes India Migration Now, as well as a host of other things, which he will explain much better. Varun, perhaps you can start with a little bit of an anecdote about what drew you to working on migration issues in the first place.
Yeah, of course. I suppose the idea of doing it in any sort of working in this space with any sort of focus started back in 2014, now a decade ago, while I was still in Europe and I'm just starting my journey there. So I was destined to be, an economist. I was a mathematician and stuff like that. And I thought, well, that's the route I'm going to take, a very academic practice. I was doing nothing with migration, was focusing on things like competition policy and that kind of space because I enjoy the sort of the analytical part of things, right? And equip myself with the tools to sort of do well in that space. But I think when I was looking for a sense of purpose, because if you can't do something academic, something analytical, you look for a sense of purpose. I think you start with your own circumstances, and I was a migrant, and I had been, albeit a privileged kind, being a student in the US, and then I was in the Netherlands. But one of the things that was very constant in my time, almost decade overseas, was I realized I was interacting with migrants of all ilk all the time. And it was those conversations and those relationships which shaped so much of my own journey, right?
Yeah, that's awesome because we need more people like you to be working on these issues. And I hope some of our listeners also begin to work more on migration. I wanted to ask you because we are talking now about financial inclusion. And could you perhaps talk a little bit about the work of the Chalo network and what exactly you've noticed with international migrants, internal migrants? Do you think that they're included in our financial systems? Why or why not?
So Chalo network obviously was about creating financial solutions for migrant households. And in our first iteration, we focused on internal migration, especially interstate migration. Someone, let's say a construction worker from Madhubani Bihar who's working in Thane in Maharashtra, just outside Bombay. So that would be a very typical customer for us. And what we would do is we would have to first find them. And so they would typically be, staying somewhere where they're working for half the year, which would be the construction site, right? So accessing construction sites, we would go there. How we access it is a whole different story. But also then once we identified them, first thing we would find out is their migration trajectory. So they would be from Madhubani, so which district, where they're from. So then we have the full sort of migration journey sort of mapped out. We know the multi-locational reality they're a part of. I mean, obviously, we were doing this in 18, 19, 20, in that range around just when COVID kicked in. And what we would always discover is they have a Jantan account. By then, people were starting to just the beginning of UPI being used across classes, across occupations. And so the payment issue they had solved through UPI, or they had some kind of setting with the shopkeeper and they would use the Aadhaar enabled payment service for that. But the account they had, especially when they had Jantan accounts, they were not active. They were often not active. They often had issues with zero balance, being defunct. And so then we were like, okay, let us fix it for you, right? We will enable it for you. And so we'll start, the first thing you do, any kind of financial service, is you have to figure out the KYC documentation, which in India typically is Aadhaar and PAN are a big part of it. It was at that juncture we faced the biggest hurdle, which is that a lot of people's Aadhaar cards had mistakes. They were not properly onboarded. Clearly, the Aadhaar onboarding project, Aadhaar has made life easier, but it has also added a level of friction in accessing basic services, which is not to say the situation was very smooth before Aadhaar. But, in practice, the onboarding exercise in many parts of India was very, very erroneously done. So there were mistakes in the father's name or their name or the village or their birth date. There were all kinds of errors that were emerging. And one of the biggest issues used to be the Aadhaar PAN mismatch. So the name or the birth date or some data mismatch between Aadhaar and PAN. And this used to lead to KYC failure. So when we're trying to onboard them into any of the financial services, including like fixing their accounts so they can sort of utilize their accounts, this became a huge barrier. So then it's okay, fine. Then our solution was, let's try and figure out how to fix this Aadhaar. And this is where the migration status became such a barrier. Because first of all, when you're a poor migrant person in a big city, you're a bit disoriented. All you know is your construction site. You might know where to catch your bus or your train. You don't know much beyond that about the place you are in, because you are especially in the first couple of years, you are just relying on your network, your immediate group of people you came with or your contractor, and they determine your reality. They are in a sense, your God in terms of determining what you know, what you don't know. And so for them to fix their Aadhaar was impossible because they didn't know where to go. They didn't know how to go about it. So bank branches are typical places where you can get your Aadhaar fixed, or you have to go to your local Aadhaar Kendra center.
Yeah. Sorry, I also wanted to ask, so when it comes to the Aadhaar, and say someone wants to fix it at a bank center, is that also a hurdle then with this one example you gave us?
We were doing that. That was service we were providing. In our pilot phases, we would literally take a group of people from a site to a bank branch and sit down and go to the person. So typically in a bank branch, they've outsourced the Aadhaar sort of support function that they have in a branch. It's been outsourced to another third party. It's not a money-making thing for branches, but they have to do it because they're required to do it. But again, not all branches have it. Some branches just don't have it. So in practice, both public and private sector banks are quite hesitant about this Aadhaar thing, but they have it. So we go there, but the setting of the branch in a city is quite intimidating for a migrant person. So it was not easy to, make them feel comfortable there. And then the bank branch is also not very keen to engage. Anyways, they're under capacity as far as Aadhaar. One person sitting there, they have lunch and they're not available. When we go sit down with them, there's always some additional documentation which would come up for every case. So the complexity of dealing with these things, for us to build an SOP to help people at a branch to this kind of in-person service was proving to be very challenging. And it's also the other part of the challenge also is that migrant construction workers, or any construction worker, but especially migrant construction workers, they're on a clock. They can't skip work. Imagine we have to bring them during the work hours, right? This is when the banks open. And so they're losing money because,
Exactly.
yes, and it's a wage loss. And this was one of the biggest issues we had. And this is one of the issues why some other more unscrupulous intermediaries would charge all kinds of money. So we were in Noida once, my team, and we discovered that the branch workers had set up their Aadhaar enabling facility with the machine they have and were charging, 500,000 rupees to do this because they were like, yeah, well, I might as well make money of doing it because these people are so desperate. Completely illegally. They're not allowed to do that, but they were doing it.
Someone is in economic desperation trying to make money, and essentially they prey on others who are in further economic desperation or in another type of economic desperation. I mean, it's the sad state of affairs in so many parts of the world, including here. The thing that struck me a lot about the Chalo network's operations and observations was this larger idea of financial inclusion. So typically when we think about financial inclusion, you think about things like, oh, does this person have a bank account? Do they have access to formalized credit, and so on and so forth? Do they have to go to an informal money lender? But what I really appreciated about what you just said as well was how even things like documentation, having an Aadhaar card with the correct details is extremely essential. And actually, that is also part of this larger conversation surrounding financial inclusion. So this actually aids me to my next question, which is, was there a situation where you just kind of had an aha moment? So you saw how a family functions. Who's usually in control of the money? Is it the man? Is it the woman? And are there those types of dynamics you've seen in certain low-wage worker households?
So I think there are two levels of framing I'll introduce here to make sense of it. One is there's the household, and there's an intra-household dynamic in terms of who migrates, who does what in terms of managing money, who interfaces with the financial services sector. It varies. I mean, obviously, like money and power, even in the household dynamic, goes hand in hand. And in a deeply patriarchal setting where a lot of our interstate migrants come from, the men tend to have, on the face of it, a lot of power. They're the ones who get to migrate the most. They decide, they seem to have the maximum agency. They are taking a lot of financial decisions. However, the one thing I learned working in the Dwara team is to always observe the informal. The arrogance of the people who benefit from the system and the arrogance of the system is to think anybody who's not part of the system, the formalized system, the formalized economy is not relevant. But actually, informality is the most common aspect, especially in the context of migration, because then when things are informal and how people find solutions and resist their circumstances, where actually the aha moments come from. That's how I look at my line of work. So while the intra-household dynamics do dictate a lot of the choices in terms of our messaging and kind of outreach we do, it is the informal practice. See, migration is a network-driven phenomena. Very few people in India, especially at a labor class level, migrate solo. Especially, in the early stages of their migration, they come in a group. They're more likely to stay in a group. They will go back in a group. And it is a group which is their survival setup. And so in a group, there'll be one person, who's been there longest. Maybe the contractor is their cousin or something, and maybe the contractor is part of the group. It could have a mix of sort of circumstances. But maybe that person, to your point, would be the one who says, give me your cash, give me your pagar, your wage. I'll deposit it in the machine so that your families can receive it. And because they are related, there's a trust network. There's one person who would be tech savvy, who would do all the tech work for everybody else. And it could be the contractor if it's a smaller contractor who is very connected to the workers. So yes, you have figures like this in their immediate network who would dominate. And for us, that was a big observation in the work we did on sites. We actually published a paper looking at labor value chains on these construction sites, looking at different contractors. So what that inspired and was the idea that we need some kind of agent. We need an agent in their trust network. The other inspiration there also is worth mentioning, again, is the Dwara KGFS approach, which is that right now in financial services, the assumption is wealth management is required by the ultra wealthy, not just the wealthy, the ultra wealthy. They flipped the script. They said the wealth management, wealth advice about money and services is the most required by those who are the poorest. And so that was a game changer as a framing for me, because I saw the impact of that. And we felt that a lot of what we were doing on the side, guiding people to branches, talking to them about their financial lives, was being a financial advisor. And then we saw these figures who would be more tech savvy, more financially savvy, who would then, they would be part of the trust network. So we were like, okay, let's start creating a agent training and agent program, what we call them Chalo Sathis, who would be our champions, our last mile service providers for these migrant communities. That was where the Chalo Sathi program and the Chalo network, which is the heart of our approach, started.
चलो नेटवर्क के माध्यम से तो एजेंट लोगों को भी हम लोग जानकारी देते हैं कि आप लोग ग्राहकों से कैसे बात करेंगे, आपकी दुकान पे क्या होना चाहिए, आपका कैसा व्यवहार होना चाहिए ग्राहकों के साथ में, इस सब चीज़ की जानकारी हम लोग एजेंटों को देते हैं.
We have trained over 100 agents who have enabled over 1 lakh transactions and reached more than 51,000 customers.
India has the largest number of banking agent networks, those sort of point providers who do cash in, cash out. They kind of have a micro ATM set up, and could be a shopkeeper, could be dedicated remittance providers. They usually work on the Aadhaar bridge, and now they're working in UPI. And so already we had an infrastructure, but they couldn't do much more than that. They can only do these payments. They couldn't do any other services like loans and stuff like that. But people just didn't want the ability to send and receive money. That obviously was a big thing for them. But they also wanted to figure out their documentation issues. They wanted to activate their bank accounts. Maybe they wanted an insurance scheme. They wanted their welfare schemes. So what Haqdarshak has done with agents also is focusing more on the social welfare side of things in this equation. And then finally, there were things like credit. So all these different things, which are fundamentally about risk management, accessing liquidity, were actually required. And all our surveying and all our sort of initial piloting revealed that. So we started building this agent network, which became a heart of our operational approach. We will try and place an agent in the destination they were in, commonly going to, and the source, the village they were coming to. So there's kind of these micro corridors where we will connect almost neighborhood locality to the pin code they were coming from. There was these pin code to pin code corridors we started mapping in our operation. And then we would figure out who's the right agent, train the agent, pay the agent to put them on a retainer, and then expand the services they would offer. Things like helping with Aadhaar, things like guidance. And these agents would be somebody who they would most likely to trust. So that became the guiding philosophy or operation.
So just to understand, Varun, do you think that one of the problems, like say that you're moving a little bit out of an urban center now and you're going to places where the financial service offerings by formal financial institutions are more sparse? Say that that's the context now. So do you think that some of these hurdles you faced, which you combated through the agents network, this large network of people you were cultivating through the Chalo network from your organization on the ground, do you think that it combated that? Or do you think that a big part of it was also doing these things like, getting an Aadhaar card in place and all of that? Do you think that part of the problem is that as we go out of urban centers, the coverage of financial services formally from banks and all of that is less, and that's the big part of the problem? Or do you think it's much more complicated than that?
So I think the thing to appreciate is that if you're a bank, you're an NBFC, you're any of these financial regulated entities by the RBI, there's a cost of delivering service. A branch is the most expensive way of delivering a banking service to your customers. It's extremely expensive to maintain a branch. So in India, the financial including mandate under the RBI's mission, the financial inclusion mission they have, has recognized this a long time ago. And so that's why what they started encouraging were these banking sakhis, banking agent kind of network, which was like, okay, you can't unbundle every aspect of a banking service, credit, insurance, all these things, investments, but maybe payments and some other things can be handled by an agent because this is cheaper. It's a good way to get people into the system, right? So this thinking of using an agent has been there in the Indian context for at least last 20 years, especially the last 15 years. So in that sense, we were building on something like the infrastructure was there and we were just applying it to the migrant context. The big thing we were solving is that it's about how you interface with the financial system. So you and I are now largely digital, right? We are using our smartphones and the apps and net banking. And at most, we might call a relationship manager on the phone or maybe visit a branch if you're doing some kind of business banking, right? That's the extent of our interfacing with the bank. Anything beyond that is expensive and difficult. None of us have the capacity, even with all our exposure and understanding. For a poor person, especially a migrant person, the digital stuff doesn't work. And we can get into the failure of the digital imagination, UI, UX designs, and how classist and exclusionary they are. But what they want is something familiar, relatable, something they trust, who can help them in access and use these financial services. And it has to be something trustworthy. Trust is very important in this. And this is what we imagined these agents to be. It's that whether I'm home or whether I'm in my Karmbhumi or in my Janmbhumi, I have a familiar, trustworthy interface, the Chalo network, Chalo Sathi, who can help me, guide me through accessing my own services or opening a services or any kind of pre-step like documentation that they may require. So that was it was an interface to the larger financial system. That's how we imagined it.
370 homes were raised by the Delhi Development Authority to desilt the Barapulla train, part of a High Court directed monsoon prep project.
अभी तो कोई सड़क में रह रहा है, कोई किराए पे रह रहा है, जो जिसके पास पैसे वो सरकारी नौकरी करता है, अच्छा नौकरी करता है उसमें रह रहा है। अभी 160 बंदे शाम को आके यहाँ सो जाते हैं। तो गवर्नमेंट थोड़ा देख के काम करवा लो। गरीब लोग पूरा मत मारना, थोड़ा सा हेल्प कर दो।
Delhi is a city built by migrants, but when the bulldozers arrive, it's always the poorest who are the first in line to lose everything. The home they build today can be lost tomorrow, and every time they must begin again.
Watch the video story only on the migrationstory.com.
There exists this city built by labor, mostly men, who disappear after their respective buildings are made. Once the last brick is laid, the laborers begin to fade before disappearing completely. Some believe the men become ghosts, haunting the facade they helped build. When visiting, take note. If outside and there are buildings nearby, ghosts may already be falling. From the book Temporary People by Deepak Unnikrishnan. For me, banking for me, or you perhaps, moved away from traditional brick and mortar kind of branches that we would go to, and you would look at it as, oh my goodness, I have to disrupt my commute. Granted, anyway, in Bombay, that commute is a very long one for most people, to go to work and back, to go to the bank branch again. So you want to do things digitally, right? So I wanted to ask you on this front, what you feel like we can do essentially to kind of counter this. Do you think we are failing by not considering essentially poorer households as customers? Basically we're looking at it as, if we develop an app and they're included, that's such a big service to them. It's almost like a charity, which is quite bad. And I've seen that attitude around. So I wanted to ask you what you thought about it.
Yeah, I think it's the intention behind what you design. So if you're a financial service or a fintech or a financial services provider, a bank, NBFC, public sector bank, all the sort of family institutions that dominate ever-growing financial services ecosystem in India, or anywhere in the world for that matter, it's the intention. Like, what is your target user base? And then what is your understanding of the user base? But if the intention is right, then you will design your whole solution set accordingly. So, for instance, to sort of illustrate this, today, if you're designing digital financial services and you want to target someone, migrant and low income. By low income, typically back then used to be around 20,000 rupees monthly income and below. Today might be closer to 25, even 30,000, depending on where you are. So that's a cutoff, used to be cutoff for us in terms of defining who's poor, who's just above poor. And then you look at the literacy level, functional literacy levels, because then if you make something that is very English oriented, doesn't have multilingual possibilities, and even when people do multilingual possibilities, they use such complicated Hindi or exact translations in Hindi that don't work. So, it's like You need to use a lot of imagery, you need to use a lot of voice guidance, you need to understand not everybody is functionally very comfortable reading and writing. A lot of people, when they use, for instance, WhatsApp, are using voice notes to communicate. So having these kinds of capabilities helps make things exclusive. And to give credit to the ecosystem, they have moved in that direction. There has been a gradual understanding of these things, and we are starting to see, for instance, I think UPI was very intuitive. I have my issues with UPI as how it was forced down our throat, but it is a very intuitive solution. It is free. It has multiple interfaces. There are multiple apps which allow you to plug into it, not just the banking apps. So people have had options to sort of get used to it. And now we see, at least in urban areas, a huge number using UPI. And payments have sort of democratized in the process somewhat, definitely relative to before demonetization. So I think the other aspect is also like, you want to do credit, you want to have credit apps which should really demystify and make it very easy to onboard people, but also appreciate the people you're targeting may not have the documentation in place. So you probably need some kind of human interface. But a lot of fintechs, the way their business models work, the way their investors work with them, they don't want to spend on humans. They want to just solve everything with technology. And by doing that, they're completely not grasping the trust deficit that exists in the eyes of someone who is a first-time formal financial services user. And so I think that's why you see very few fintechs building for the poor population. There are many who are doing that, actually more than they used to, but they're still, given like we're talking about over 1 billion people who might fit. I'm not just talking about migrants now, but I'm saying the larger, poorer population, as I defined, 25,000 rupees below household income. That's bulk of India. Very few people are actually building just for them. We have left them to the public financial services infrastructure. We say, you use that and that's the best you can do. And public financial services have other issues. They try and innovate. They have their branches. They do have their mandates because of the RBI. But what they build is still not, again, it's just a tip of the iceberg on what they've built. There's so much more that can be done in the sort of digital inclusion journey, right? And I'm just talking about the entry point. Now I'm making sure people use it, the post-sale support, the grievance redressal mechanisms. There is still a long way to go. I don't think people are familiar at all with many of these things. And a part of it is how, whether it's public sector, their cooperative banks, and the new age fintechs, how we can be more intentional in our design, in the way we design our services, and mindful to include the bulk of people who are still underbanked. I hope that sort of addresses what
that addresses it very well. And I was just thinking that perhaps the kind of little bit of a conundrum is that the assumption perhaps is that the degree to which things are lucrative is greater for fintech sort of setups, startups, organizations, so on, if the income groups that they are targeting are slightly higher income groups. This is my assumption premised on what
yeah,
you said.
that's correct.
Yes, then that's part of the problem. And then the assumption then thereafter is that if someone tends to be targeting groups to prefer financial services for lower income groups, then there is this kind of, oh, we're doing this in a kind of charity type of case somewhere. Is that, it's the, what is the perhaps other way of putting it? It's like the save the world kind of mentality. I mean, obviously, all of us should work to be socially minded, and everyone in the world actually should aim to do so.
Yeah.
But not in this, because there is a kind of veneer of condescension then. Not this understanding that if people were just born into different circumstances, if they were born into a richer family, like that kind of equity and equality arguments as to why people are in circumstances now that they are in is often forgotten in that larger context. And I think that you highlighted that very, very well.
No, but I would like double down on this point. And it's a big problem in the nonprofit sector. I think what we saw was when we went as a nonprofit impact-oriented framing to our end beneficiaries, they didn't trust us. They were like, what do you want? Right? They really didn't trust our intention. But the moment we saw them as customers who we valued and took that framing and went to them, met them at the level, grounded, we saw a lot more buy-in. We saw a lot better conversations. We saw better success rates. So I think it is not a charity. These are sophisticated financial users. They just happen to be doing it in an informal setting, not a formal setting. I think that's the big reframing I would encourage. And people who have been working financial inclusion for the last 30, 40 years in India know this. because they deal with this every day. But I think a lot of fintechs and a lot of investors, they need to understand this. The other big issue is that the money, the capitalization of companies, even for us, I mean, forget lucrative. The key metric for us used to be the user acquisition cost and then repeat usage. User acquisition, when you're trying to onboard someone in an urban area, really far flung, is more expensive. I have to pay a wage. I have to try many different things before the person actually trusts me. It's an expensive endeavor, and it takes time to build that trust and network and traction. So you need, as a company, you need capital and investors who are patient. Now, typically, when we have this conversation, we start getting into grants and we're getting into some kind of impact investors. But the reality is, most of the capital out there is not that patient. They're looking for returns quite quickly. So the fundamental structure of how I think a lot of financing, the kind of capital that's available for a new financial institution, is also determining a lot of choices. There are a few notable companies who have beaten the trend, but for the most part, it is not seen, to your point, forget lucrative or even sustainable to focus on just the poorer population like labor migrants. It's definitely a structural issue. The typical solution, it is worth observing that what, for instance, microfinance institutions do and some people in this space have done is that two tiers of customer. They'll have a lucrative customer and then they will have a quote unquote impact oriented, but a poorer customer. But then it's important that you retain the same sharpness and quality and respect for both sets of customers. You don't distinguish in your intention when you're designing that.
I think that that's a very good point, Varun. And actually, this just made me think about this. Like, perhaps my assumption would be that, say, there are lower income groups who get targeted to these, and or perhaps they are the ones for whom financial services are preferred. And that's the emphasis. My assumption would be that although there's a longer loop around for that, or kind of gestation period for actually making money through that is much longer and would require a longer investment horizon, much longer. My assumption is that the benefits that would come from that in the longer term for an economy, because say someone then is able to move like up the ladder a little bit economically, I would assume that that would be more. But I think that perhaps the kind of horizon or the time horizon we're speaking of is just far longer, and that is why the appetite is less. Is that also part of it?
Yeah, absolutely. It takes a while to build a foothold because, it's about scaling trust. Financial services, when you're a financial service provider, you're handling people's money, you're touching their money. It's a fiduciary responsibility you have to. It's like being a doctor. It's another framing we use in the Vara. Like, it's a serious responsibility to give financial advice, to handle their money. And the way people are with you about that kind of stuff reveals that at every class level. Everybody is, who are you? Where are you from? What's your track record? Everybody asks that question. It's a universal question, and they should be, because it's a huge part of their lives. And so, it's a fiduciary responsibility, and you have to be very, very careful and inclusive and respectful of people, irrespective. And perhaps when people are the poorest of circumstances, they have a lot more to lose. And so I think when you're building solutions for the poorest, and just to maybe ground it more in the migration context, imagine you're not just poor, but you're also in an unfamiliar setting. You're in an urban setting. You don't know people beyond the trust network I defined earlier. So it's even more difficult to earn their trust, which led to us doing a lot of our onboarding eventually via contractors or employers. But more so, we started doing it more and where they come from, in the villages they come from. That's what became the incidence points, because they were more likely to trust us in the village with that agent than in the city. Because city is unfamiliar. There are all kinds of people there. There are people who take advantage of you, who you don't know how to trust. You don't even have a framework of how to trust someone. You're still establishing that. So it does take a long time. As a result of all of these things, it takes a long time to iterate, build trust. It's patient work. And you need to have almost decade-long time horizons.
Yeah. No, I think that that's very fascinating, Varun. So basically, you were saying that, say someone has emigrated to the city, or part of it has that they've moved from like sort of rural to urban migration. Their trust, from what you described, is still more in the kind of essentially kinship networks, social networks, as opposed to the kind of brick and mortar financial institutions, which are perhaps more formalized in nature. And I mean, that's an entirely valid way of being in existence. It's just perhaps a different one from what we see amongst more elite urbanized setups in India. Yeah, this has been such a fascinating conversation. I mean, This reminded me a little bit of one of the things I saw in the banking sector in Oman, which is where I used to work and I grew up. And I noticed that some of them were sometimes a little bit hesitant to go up to ATMs. And a lot of banks, what they started to do was have these sort of meter greeters at the entrance of banks to help usher people to ATMs and help them through the process of using it for the first or second time. And others, and it's very interesting because these are Gulf states and typically known also. And I mean, in the UAE context, other contexts, they have been rightly also pulled up for extractive practices, exploitative practices towards low wage migrants. But I've also seen on the flip side some of these evolutions where languages on ATMs are in Tagalog or in Malayalam or in Hindi, which is also great. And I think that that's the idea somewhere of what you have been trying to talk about. So on the one hand, using tech as a solution is of course something that could be explored and ought to be explored, but not without losing sight of the human centricity of it and the social aspects of a lot of the problems that we're grappling with.
Yeah, absolutely. We've done work in Oman. So we were working with a partner in Oman with Indian construction workers and manufacturing workers who all live in the camps outside Muscat and those places. And we had a banking partner who was very keen to provide them bank accounts which allow remittances to happen through a formalized channel. Because typically right now in Oman, what was happening is because their banks were defunct or they found bank to bank transfers very expensive. So despite the fact that their wages were deposited in the central bank and the local banks that they had there, because they had to as a mandate, the employer had to deposit there, they will draw the wages. And that would happen at the campsite. They would have someone would go from the branch or some intermediary who was entrepreneurial like us, would go to them and would help them withdraw their money and then do a sort of Hawala transfer straight to the village. The intermediary solved the problem. The financial sector couldn't solve. And
Exactly.
so we thought, okay, let's work with Indian Good Bank and make them aware of this issue. We met the team, the risk teams. We got everything set up. We had a partner in Oman. We said, let's do it. We have about 20,000 people. We'll get them accounts. But then this documentation problem struck us, which was that we had to get their residency proof. That was the key. And the residency proof needs to have address proof. And in Oman, the ID card, national ID card, you will know this better than me, doesn't have the address proof on it. Like India, we have address. Oman national ID doesn't have address. But there are other ways of getting address proof. But turned out, because they were living in these sort of setups outside the city, there was no address. There's only one address, the employer's address. That didn't work. So as a result, because of this address proof problem, the other problem was the cost of doing the apostilling and all the documentation had to be sort of approved from the branch, the bank branch. We even managed to swing that. It was expensive, but we managed to swing that and the bank were willing to eat the cost. Despite that, this address proof was such an acute problem where the sector regulations and the kind of documentation they have in Oman were mismatching with the KYC regulations, the RBI master KYC regulations, and what the bank required in India, led to financial underserving and underbanking of even international migrants in Oman. People who've been there making great money, they couldn't even access these financial services despite the best efforts. We had two fintechs, us and in Oman, a partner. We had employers, we had branch, we were doing things by the book. But despite that, and here's the catch, right? It was happening because the employer in Oman didn't want to issue and reveal to the authorities the fact that they didn't have a proper address proof and proper housing for their Indian migrant workers. They didn't want to reveal the fact. So they wanted to shut it down.
Yeah, so that's the thing. That's the thing. All of these things invariably they're so linked, and it becomes a problem. And I think that that's a very, very good example, Varun, of like once you start to untangle things, which problem do you address first? And very often I've seen this. I've spoken to other people also in the space, and they've told me exactly, even in our conversations before. Like, I don't know with the Chalo network, if you thought that the Aadhaar would be one of the big stumbling blocks you would face, wherein people had, not the right Aadhaar number, some 3 digits off, the wrong address on it, or so on and so forth, and how that would be part of this larger financial inclusion endeavor. And I think that that kind of underscores how finances are linked very closely with larger social and, I mean, basically like social conditions, social circumstances, systemic and structural issues that also need to be addressed. So, I mean, that comes to the end of this episode. Varun, thank you so much. This has been such a lovely and fascinating conversation. I think that what you said at the end is also like an indicator to what people should be working on more. And all the best to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Namrata. Take care.
Take care.
Check out our website www.themigrationstory.com for more content. You can subscribe to our podcast on YouTube and Spotify. The audio editing and sound design is by Akshay Ramuhalli. Stay tuned for more stories on migration.
The Migration Story.